So here we have it, the last chapter. Well, it's actually 2 chapters, but the last bit of our story of George's Marvellous Medicine. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. We'll just have to decide what we're going to read next. Are you ready? There's still something you've left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think what it would be, George said. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky said. Put it in. You'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very forlorn. George looked pretty fed up too. He was still kneeling on the ground with a spoon in one hand and a cup full of medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny brown hen was walking slowly away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard. From her enormous height, she glared down at the 3 people below her and she shouted, What's going on here? Why hasn't anybody brought me my tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice, but I'll be blowed if I'm going to starve as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttered toast. Oh, I'm sorry, Mother, Mrs. Cranky said. We've been terribly busy. I'll get you something right away. Let George get it, the lazy little brute, Grandma shouted. Just then, the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down and peered into it. She saw that it was full of brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. Ho-ho! She cried. Ha-ha! So that's your little game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make sure you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you don't think to bring one to your poor old grandma. I always knew you were a selfish pig. No, Grandma, George said. That isn't... Don't lie to me, boy, the enormous old hag shouted. Pass it up here this minute. No, cried Mrs. Cranky. No, Mother, don't. That's not for you. Now you're against me too, shouted Grandma. My own daughter trying to stop me having my breakfast, trying to starve me out. Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrible old woman and smiled sweetly. Of course it's for you, Grandma, he said. You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot. I don't think I won't, Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge horny hand for the cup. Hand it over, George. No, Grandma, George called out, pulling the cup away. You mustn't. You're not to have it. Give it to me, boy, yelled Grandma. Don't, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's George's marvellous... Everything's George's round here, shouted Grandma. George is this, George is that. I'm fed up with it. She snatched the cup out of little George's hand and carried it high up out of reach. Drink it up, Grandma, Mr. Cranky shouted, grinning hugely. Lovely tea. No, the other 2 cried out. No. But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. Mother, wailed Mrs. Cranky, you've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvellous Medicine number 4, and look at that one tiny spoonful did to the little brown hen. But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. This is going to be interesting, Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. Now you've done it, Mrs. Cranky glared at her husband. You've cooked the old girl's goose. I didn't do anything, Mr. Cranky said. Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it. A tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. She'll feel better after she's left out a little bit of steam, Mr. Cranky said. She's going to blow up, Mrs. Cranky wailed. Her boiler's going to burst. Stand clear, Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. The jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old hag's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt his ears. Call the fire brigade, cried Mrs. Cranky. Call the police, man the hose pipes. Too late, said Mr. Cranky, looking pleased. Grandma, shouted Mrs. Cranky. Mother, run to the drinking trough even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. That was when Grandma began to get smaller. She had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, and now she was coming down fast. "Watch this, George!" Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard and flapping his arms. "Watch what happens when someone had 50 spoonfuls instead of one." Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. "Stop!" Mrs. Cranky said. "That's just right." But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller she got. Down and down she went. In another half a minute, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny little face still bore the same foul and furious expression it always had. Her eyes, no bigger than little keyholes, were blazing in anger. "How do I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you've been a glorious giant 1 moment ago and suddenly you're a miserable midget?" "She's still going," shouted Mr. Cranky gleefully. "She's getting smaller." And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a cigarette, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her out in her hands and cried, "How do I stop her getting smaller still?" "You can't," said Mr. Cranky. "She had 50 times the right amount." "I must stop her," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "I can't hardly see her as it is." "Catch hold of it each end and pull," Mr. Cranky said. But then Grandpa was the size of a matchstick, still shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then... "Where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. "I've lost her." "Hooray!" said Mr. Cranky. "She's gone. She's disappeared completely." "That's what happens if you're grumpy and bad-tempered," said Mr. Cranky. "A great medicine of yours, George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you got to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, "Oh, well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she?" Yes," Mr. Cranky said. "She most certainly was." George didn't say a word. He felt quite trembly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning, and for a few brief moments he touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magic world. And that is the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. We're going to find another one soon.